They did not just hide their missiles somewhere convenient. They built an entire underground arsenal, carved hundreds of meters down through some of the hardest, most unforgiving granite on the planet, chosen specifically because nothing was supposed to reach through it. And for years, with total confidence, they dared anyone on Earth to come find it. Then America actually tried to get in. What happened next is not the clean, simple breakthrough most coverage wants you to believe. It is something stranger, messier, far more complicated than a headline can hold. A story about a way-in that worked exactly as designed against one specific, carefully chosen target, and a sprawling mountain network that, by most available assessments, is still mostly intact everywhere else across the country. Both of those things are true at the exact same time, and understanding why is the only way to actually understand what just happened over Iran. The headlines will tell you America cracked the mountain wide open. The full picture, once you sit with it, is a lot messier than that. And it matters for a lot more than just Iran. To understand why this mattered enough to risk an operation this dangerous, you need to understand what Iran spent decades building underground, and why it kept American planners awake at night long before a single operation ever launched. Iran's missile program did not appear overnight. It was assembled piece by piece across decades, sometimes with quiet help from countries that had their own reasons to want America's reach in the region limited. Iran built one of the largest ballistic missile arsenals anywhere in the Middle East. Short-range systems for nearby targets, medium-range systems capable of reaching deep into neighboring countries, longer-range missiles capable of striking targets well over 1,000 miles from Iranian soil. But the raw number of missiles was never really the part that worried American military planners most. It was where Iran chose to put them, and the patience with which they built that infrastructure out of public view for years before anyone outside the country fully understood its scale. Iranian planners had been watching how modern wars actually unfold for a long time, and they drew a very specific lesson from it. Decades of American and coalition air power had demonstrated exactly what happens to military hardware left out in the open. Tanks and artillery destroyed from the air before they could fire a shot. Command centers and supply depots flattened in hours. The lesson Iran took from that was simple. If you want anything to survive contact with American air power, you do not leave it on the surface. You go underground, as deep as the engineering allows. According to open-source investigations and detailed satellite analysis conducted over the years, the Revolutionary Guard has spent the past few decades digging close to 30 of these underground missile complexes, each one carved directly into granite mountain ranges scattered across the country. These are not simple bunkers in any meaningful sense of the word. They are described by analysts who have studied the imagery as functioning more like hidden subterranean cities than ordinary military bases, complete with automated rail systems capable of moving a fully assembled ballistic missile from deep storage all the way to a launch-ready position at a tunnel entrance in a matter of minutes. Vertical launch shafts sealed behind reinforced blast doors, shock-absorbing gravel packed deliberately around the chambers to keep the surrounding rock from splintering and collapsing inward during near-miss bombing runs from above. One of the most significant sites sits roughly 500 meters deep inside a mountain, carved directly into some of the hardest granite formations found anywhere on the planet. Rock so dense that ordinary excavation equipment alone could never have managed it without decades of specialized engineering support. Construction on this scale does not happen quickly, and it certainly does not happen cheaply. And the simple fact that Iran sustained this kind of relentless construction effort across multiple separate mountain ranges for decades, largely without the rest of the world fully noticing the true scope of it until it was already finished, says something significant on its own about exactly how seriously Iran's military planners took the underlying threat they genuinely believed they were preparing against. Iran's concealment methods were patient and deliberate, refined over years of trial and adjustment. Construction happened mostly at night, under cover of darkness, with crews trained to leave minimal visible trace before sunrise. Excavated rock was deliberately spread out across wide, unrelated areas specifically, so satellite analysts studying the imagery could not reliably estimate how much material had actually been removed from any single site. Surface-to-air missile batteries were positioned nearby specifically to discourage reconnaissance aircraft from getting close enough for a clearer, more conclusive look. Tunnel entrances were disguised to resemble natural rock formations, indistinguishable to the untrained eye. Some entrances were built as deliberate decoys leading nowhere at all, while the real, functioning access points were camouflaged among the mountain's natural contours, blended seamlessly into terrain that had looked unremarkable for centuries. This kind of layered deception, decoy entrances mixed with genuine ones, debris spread thin enough to defeat volumetric analysis from above, is the sort of operational security normally associated with state programs that have studied exactly how foreign intelligence services build their assessments and worked backward from there to defeat them. By the time Western intelligence agencies pieced together a reasonably complete picture of what had actually been built, the scale of it was staggering. Dozens of sites scattered across multiple mountain ranges, engineered specifically to put Iran's most valuable military assets permanently beyond the reach of whatever weapons existed at the time. Analysts who spent years piecing this picture together from fragments of satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and painstaking geological comparison described the moment the full scope finally became clear as less a single revelation and more a dawning realization that what they were looking at was not a handful of bunkers, but an entire parallel military infrastructure hidden in plain sight beneath the surface of an entire nation. For years, American planners understood the gap between what they had and what they needed. Existing bunker-busting weapons were serious tools, capable of chewing through several meters of reinforced concrete before detonating. But several meters of concrete is one problem. Hundreds of meters of solid granite spread across dozens of separate sites is an entirely different one. Against the kind of deeply buried, deliberately distributed network Iran had spent decades constructing, conventional penetrating weapons were never going to be enough on their own, and finding a way in was never going to be a single bomb solving a single hole. It was always going to be a different kind of problem entirely, a problem of mapping, patience, and precision applied one specific target at a time, quietly, away from headlines. That problem had been worked for years. Specialized penetrating munitions, refined repeatedly over nearly 2 decades, were paired with an entirely separate layer of effort that almost nobody outside a small circle of officials ever saw. Intelligence officers spent years building a granular picture of one specific facility, its exact depth, its rock composition, its ventilation architecture, the precise coordinates needed to guide a weapon's fuse to detonate at exactly the right point along its path through solid rock. Major Jessica Anderson was one of the people inside that effort, a targeting and intelligence officer who spent years working a single narrowly defined problem alongside a small, tightly compartmented team that almost nobody outside a few secure rooms ever heard about. How do you find a way into a facility built specifically because its designers believed, with total confidence, that no existing capability anywhere in the world could ever reach it? It is worth sitting with how unusual that level of patience actually is inside a defense and intelligence bureaucracy that often prioritizes faster, more visible, more politically convenient programs over slow, grinding, unglamorous work. Major Anderson and her team spent years on one single site, and one site only, refining the targeting data down to the smallest detail, refining the angle of approach until the margin for error nearly disappeared, refining exactly what it would take to turn theoretical penetration into a confirmed, repeatable, combat-proven result, long before anyone in the public was paying attention to the program at all, long before any of this had a name anyone outside a classified briefing would ever hear. That focused, patient effort is exactly what culminated in the operation that finally put years of design and intelligence work into actual combat use. In the early hours of the strike, after earlier operations had already damaged significant portions of Iran's broader military infrastructure but had not been able to finish the job at the deepest, most hardened site, American stealth aircraft launched what would become one of the most technically demanding precision strikes in recent memory. Stealth bombers flew for hours across multiple aerial refuelings, supported by more than 100 additional aircraft, tankers, and surveillance assets, along with a separate strike package aimed at supporting targets elsewhere. Reaching the target from distant friendly territory required a logistical undertaking on its own before a single weapon was ever released. Multiple aircraft dropped a sequence of penetrating munitions on the same impact point, one after another, each successive strike driving further down the channel carved by the one before it, achieving a combined penetration depth that no single weapon could manage alone. According to senior defense officials, the strike package moved through contested airspace with minimal resistance, and the specific facility being targeted appears to have had no idea the attack was coming until it was already underway. This was the culmination of nearly 2 decades of design, testing, refinement, and painstaking intelligence work, all aimed specifically and exclusively at this one kind of target, this one kind of problem, this one specific mountain. Satellite imagery reviewed afterward, along with testimony from senior officials briefed on the outcome, indicated the strike caused severe, structurally significant damage to the facility, and outside analysts who reviewed the same imagery independently described the site as very badly hurt in the aftermath, language that, in the careful, hedged world of intelligence assessment, carries considerably more weight than it might first appear to. The strategic and psychological significance of that result is hard to overstate. For more than a decade, the central assumption underpinning a major piece of Iran's defensive strategy was that burying critical infrastructure deep enough inside a mountain put it permanently beyond the reach of any conventional capability on Earth. That assumption did not survive contact with the weapon and the intelligence work behind it. A facility that had been planned, funded, and defended internally for years on the premise that depth alone equaled permanent safety now has a documented counterexample sitting in the open. One that cannot be argued away through state media or domestic propaganda the way earlier setbacks sometimes were. Whatever else is true about everything else buried under those mountains, the specific claim that depth alone guarantees permanent safety from American capability has now been tested in actual combat rather than in a simulation. And it did not hold. Not at that site. But here is where things take a serious turn, because the story most coverage tells from this point forward gets considerably less honest. A lot of recent reporting blurs that single successful breach into a broader claim that Iran's entire underground missile network has also been cracked open. That the mountain shield protecting Iran's ballistic missile arsenal across the country is now finished. That is not what the available evidence actually shows. The facility that was successfully breached was a single, well-mapped, intensively studied site, a different category of target entirely from the dozens of underground missile complexes scattered elsewhere across Iran's mountain ranges. And the broader campaign against those missile facilities has produced a very different result. According to open-source assessments, even after extensive strikes aimed specifically at Iran's missile infrastructure, the majority of visible tunnel entrances were hit, craters were created in ventilation shafts, and surface facilities were damaged across the country. And yet assessments indicate the underground structures themselves remain largely intact. Construction crews reportedly arrived within days of the strikes to begin clearing debris. Access routes back into the mountains were reopened, and operations reportedly resumed at sites that had supposedly just been taken offline. That kind of rapid recovery is not what a permanently disabled facility looks like. It is closer to what engineers would expect from a hardened site designed from the outset with exactly this kind of repair cycle in mind. Pre-built access roads, on-site heavy equipment, crews trained specifically for fast restoration after a near miss. Analysts who have reviewed the open-source evidence on these missile complexes have specifically noted that even using the same technique that worked at the successfully breached site, firing additional munitions into the same impact crater to drive penetration deeper, existing weapons would likely struggle to reach the actual interior chambers of Iran's deepest missile bases, because many of these sites are dug even deeper into harder rock than the facility America found a way into. What most people don't realize is that this is not really a contradiction. It is two different engineering problems with two different outcomes. The capability used in the successful strike was designed, tested, and refined over nearly 2 decades, specifically against the geology and depth found at one well-understood target. It performed exactly as intended there. Iran's broader missile network was never the weapon's primary design target, and several of those complexes, according to engineering assessments, sit deeper and inside harder rock than the site that was actually breached. A capability proving itself against one category of buried target does not automatically mean every other underground facility on the planet has suddenly become equally vulnerable. And treating those two outcomes as the same story flattens something that is actually far more interesting and far more useful to understand correctly. Geology is not a uniform variable across an entire country. The depth of rock above a tunnel, the hardness of that rock, the angle at which a weapon strikes it, all of these factors change the equation independently, which means success at one site is at best a single data point, rather than a guarantee about every other buried facility built under different conditions. So what does that mean for the regional calculus Iran has spent decades building around its missile arsenal? One specific facility took a documented, severe hit, the kind that strategic planners in Tehran cannot simply explain away or wave off as propaganda, because the evidence sits in satellite imagery reviewed by independent analysts on every side of this conflict. The missile network, by contrast, appears to have absorbed real damage at the surface and at tunnel entrances without losing its core function, which means the deterrent value Iran built around its ballistic missile stockpile has been bruised rather than broken. That distinction matters enormously for what happens next, because a regime that believes one critical pillar of its strategy has been set back, but its broader conventional missile deterrent remains largely functional, negotiates very differently than one that believes its entire underground strategy has collapsed simultaneously. A government that still believes it retains a credible missile force has far more room to project confidence at the negotiating table than one that believes every category of buried asset it tried to protect has failed. There is also a wider audience watching all of this far beyond Iran's own borders, and they are drawing two very different lessons depending on which outcome they are studying. Military planners in capitals around the world, with significant investment in underground military infrastructure, are studying the successful breach closely because it demonstrates that nearly 2 decades of patient, purpose-built intelligence and engineering work can eventually find a way into even a deeply buried, hardened target if the effort is focused specifically and precisely enough on that exact site. At the same time, those same planners are studying the missile network outcome just as closely, because it demonstrates the opposite lesson, that sufficiently deep, sufficiently hardened, sufficiently distributed underground infrastructure can absorb sustained conventional bombing and still resume functioning within days. Both lessons are now part of the global record, and which one a given government chooses to take more seriously probably depends on how deep and how distributed its own underground assets already are. A country with a handful of deep, concentrated facilities has more reason to worry about the precedent set by the successful breach. A country that has spread its most critical assets across dozens of smaller, well-distributed, deeply buried sites has more reason to take comfort in how the broader missile network held up. None of this settles the broader argument about whether an operation this aggressive was the right call, and that disagreement is not going away anytime soon. Critics warn that military action of this scale risks further escalation, strengthens hardline factions inside Iran's government, who can now point to American aggression as justification for their own posture, and makes any future diplomatic path considerably harder to walk. They argue that years of patient pressure, not strikes however precise, were always the more durable answer, and that military solutions tend to produce short-term setbacks rather than long-term resolution of the underlying political problem. Supporters of the operation counter that years of pressure had produced very little actual change in Iran's underlying behavior, that the targeted facility represented a uniquely urgent threat conventional pressure had failed to slow, and that allowing Iran to believe any part of its strategic infrastructure was untouchable was itself a dangerous invitation to keep building further. They point to the nearly 2-decade gap between when planners first recognized the problem and when they finally had the capability and intelligence picture needed to solve it, as evidence that pressure alone had not been sufficient to change Iran's underlying calculus. Both arguments contain real substance, and reasonable people who have studied this closely land on different sides of it. What happens next inside Iran is genuinely difficult to predict with any confidence. Iran's leadership has historically favored calculated, controlled responses over open escalation, largely because the gap in raw military capability between Iran and the United States is not something Iran's own planners seriously dispute behind closed doors. But domestic politics complicate that calculation considerably. The same hardline factions who spent years boasting about the invincibility of these mountain facilities, who built real political capital on the claim that no American capability could ever reach them, now face a documented, undeniable counterexample sitting in satellite photographs, available to anyone who looks. That kind of public embarrassment can push toward responses driven more by the need to save face domestically than by any careful assessment of strategic risk. A faction that built its legitimacy on a claim of invincibility does not simply abandon that claim quietly once it has been disproven. It tends to look for the next arena where it can reassert the narrative. Whether that arena is rhetorical, diplomatic, or something considerably more dangerous, one thing does seem settled regardless of how the rest of this plays out. The mountain Iran built around its most sensitive site is no longer the absolute shield its own engineers spent nearly 2 decades believing it would always be. And that single fact has permanently reshaped how every government on Earth with deeply buried military infrastructure thinks about its own vulnerability. But the broader mountain network Iran built around its missile arsenal, the dozens of sites still apparently functioning weeks after sustained bombing, tells a more complicated story. one where depth and distribution still buy real protection, even against the most advanced capability America has ever built for exactly this purpose. It is worth pausing on why that asymmetry exists at all, because it is not simply a matter of one capability being more powerful than another. The successfully breached facility was a known fixed target that American intelligence services had been studying in granular detail for nearly 2 decades, mapping its exact depth, its rock composition, its ventilation architecture, down to the specific coordinates needed to guide each weapon's fuse. Iran's missile network, by contrast, numbers in the dozens, spread across multiple mountain ranges, many of them still only partially mapped by outside intelligence, despite years of effort, with decoy entrances and camouflaged access points specifically designed to keep that mapping incomplete. Finding a way into one well-understood target is a fundamentally different problem than finding a way into 30 distributed, partially unknown targets, several of which may sit even deeper than the one site that has already been breached. That is the actual reason the outcomes diverge so sharply. Not a failure of American capability, but a difference in how concentrated and how well mapped the two categories of target actually were going into the operation. Whether that gap between the two outcomes closes, widens, or simply hardens into the next phase of this standoff is the question every military planner studying this conflict in Washington, in Tehran, and everywhere else with a mountain to hide things inside of is now trying to answer. If American intelligence services spend the coming years doing for the missile network what they spent the previous 2 decades doing for the one site they successfully breached, mapping each facility in granular detail, understanding the specific rock composition and depth of every individual complex, the same kind of purpose-built solution that worked once could eventually be developed against the broader missile network as well. That is not a fast process, and nothing about the engineering and intelligence challenge involved suggests it would be. But the successful breach proved the model works, given enough time and enough specific intelligence. And time is the one resource that tends to favor whichever side is willing to spend nearly 2 decades solving one very hard problem at a time. For Iran, the lesson sitting underneath all of this is genuinely uncomfortable. Regardless of which facilities held up and which did not, the entire strategic premise behind building these mountain fortresses in the first place was that depth alone would buy permanent safety. A closed argument that ended the conversation about vulnerability once the tunnels were finished. That premise has now been partially disproven in actual combat, not in a think tank paper or a classified briefing, but in satellite photographs that every government and every intelligence agency on the planet has now had the chance to study. Whatever Iran decides to build next, underground or otherwise, it will be building it with the hard, uncomfortable knowledge that depth bought time, not permanence, and that the patience, the painstaking intelligence work, and the enormous resources required for America to eventually find a way in, even against a single target its own engineers spent years believing was completely unreachable by anything on Earth, are resources the United States has now demonstrated, in full view of every government on the planet, that it is willing to spend without hesitation. Major Jessica Anderson and the small, quiet team behind her spent years proving something that no amount of granite, no amount of depth, and no amount of confident state propaganda could ever fully disprove. No mountain is truly the final word on safety. It is only ever the most recent one, waiting for someone patient enough to come looking.